Screen Queensland. And welcome to this very special In Conversation with Jon Kuyper, which was going to be an in-person event, but obviously, as you can see, we're coming to you from the safety of, in my case, Mount Tambourine, and in Jon's case, a little cabin somewhere in Australia. So first of all, welcome, Jon.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we find ourselves, wherever you are watching this from, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Australia is gifted with the original storytellers and the oldest continuous Indigenous culture in the world, and we are very blessed to live in a country such as this. Well, Jon, I'll do a little intro to give people some idea of your very storied career, and for such a clearly young man, you've done a lot. Jon began his producing career for Roger Corman, of all people, in Los Angeles in the 90s, and you've gone on to work, produce or supervise production on more than 60 films worldwide, with budgets ranging from $300,000 to over $100 million across all genres. And as a senior vice president at Warner Brothers, Jon has supervised production of The Great Gatsby, which won 2 Oscars by Australia's own Baz Luhrmann, of course, the Hobbit trilogy, Mad Max Fury Road, which also won a number of Oscars. And in 2013, Jon oversaw production on Gods of Egypt and the last 2 installments of The Hunger Games for Lionsgate. Since 2014, Jon has produced The Last Face, which was directed by Sean Penn and shot in South Africa, starring Javier Bardem and Charlize Theron. He also produced 24 Hours to Live with Ethan Hawke and Action Point, a comedy for Paramount Pictures. In 2019, Jon was working with Ridley Scott on the series Raised by Wolves for HBO Max. And currently, Jon is at home in Australia, where he has lived for a long time, most recently finishing up production on Ron Howard's next film for MGM, which was shot in Queensland, of course, 13 Lives, and which we're really looking forward to talking to about today. So, Jon, thank you and welcome.
Thanks for that introduction. And yes, it's been sometimes you don't look back on your career until a moment like this where someone reminds you, and you go, oh yeah, so. Thanks for that. It's great.
You've worked with some pretty big names. I mean, not only in Australia, but internationally. The first question I would really love to ask, and I'm sure all of those listening would like to know what Ron Howard is like, because he is such a famous director. How was that to work with him most recently on 13 Lives?
Definitely a career highlight. He is not only, a gifted Academy Award-winning director, and someone who is, seems to be one of the nicest collaborative people. Well, what you see is what you get. It's exactly the way he is. He's incredible to work with. One of the things that he has in common with many other, elite directors like that, while he has a different approach, I think personality-wise, he's just collaborative. He's incredibly intelligent, perceptive, he's welcoming, he's easy to work with, but you really have to be on your toes. His level of precision and detail, his research that goes into every film he does, and a lot of films that he's done, in fact, are based on true stories, and that's something that's very near and dear to his heart, and something that I think he loves, teasing out all of those amazing little tiny things and details that no one knows about in the moment of, whether it's Apollo 13 or whether it's in the case of the Thai cave rescue in 13 Lives. It's one of those things that is just so fascinating to watch, because so much of the nuance and the honesty of the story comes out through that research, which he dives into. I can't tell you how deeply, but Baz Luhrmann is another one who, he spends years researching the story and the history and all of the things that surround it on all of his films, and gets into it and gets into that that granular kind of storytelling fodder, and then he starts sifting out what makes what helps the character to sing, or what helps the story to really resonate with people, and I think that's a fascinating thing. But yeah, Ron surprisingly, is just one of the nicest people I've ever met. And so, and Kylie, you met him, and he is exactly that on every single day. That's not to say that there aren't frustrations. That's not to say that his films go more smoothly than anyone else's. But he does a lot of preparation, and he's very good at communicating. So there are quite few surprises compared to, I think, other films. It was almost like a military operation. I think on the 59 days of filming, and by the way, those were 10-hour days. I'm not sure we went into 1 minute of overtime. I mean, it was close a few times, but
Really? Wow.
that's a testament to how well he's planned and how well he has an executive producer who's also his first AD, whom you also met, who they've been working together for a long time, and they really have this kind of precision, not just with the storytelling and the way they get into it with the characters and everything, but the way they schedule it and the way they figure it out and the way they attack how to tell the story. So yeah, it was a great career highlight. Absolutely.
Well, that's good to hear. And in fact, you mentioned Baz Luhrmann, and of course, at the same time that you were filming 13 Lives in Queensland, Baz Luhrmann has been finishing up his Elvis film in Queensland. So we've been blessed to have some amazing work going on here in the last year and a half, despite all the challenges.
Yeah.
Now, obviously that film about the Thai cave rescue is based on a true story. And in fact, we all know the ending. We all know the outcome. How does a writer and a director and a producer work with a story like that to ensure that the audience is still going to be, really surprised and really challenged along the way and really get involved in the story?
It's a great question, Kylie. That is something that I think that's where a filmmaker like Ron Howard, it's all about choosing the story. It's choosing a story that's compelling enough to be able to present to audiences when they know the story and they know the ending, and hopefully it's a happy ending, but sometimes it's not. But what happens in between, and getting personal and getting into the characters, into the hero's head, and understanding all of these decisions that they have to make along the way. And Ron Howard, interestingly enough, he actually is has been directing a number of documentaries as well. So this is really kind of a different reflection of his storytelling passion. So, and I would highly recommend all of his films, but his documentaries are really, really, really neat. I think, in the case of, if you look at two films that stand out for me, again, Apollo 13 and 13 Lives. We know the story, we know the ending. Thankfully, it's a happy ending. So, I'm always a sucker for a happy ending, and maybe that's a little too cliche, but it's nice to be able to have a nice time at the movies, and a great experience. But it's that heroic character journey, and how they go from the beginning of the movie, what happens to them, the hands that they're dealt, and how they react, and then how they change, and how the outcome is born. So I think it's about selecting the story, and that's something that before I started working with Ron, I had a subscription that my brother bought for Masterclass, and Martin Scorsese and Ron Howard and a number of filmmakers, but also composers and and chefs and everything else is on there. Ron Howard has a masterclass that is, I don't know how many hours long. I mean, it is in depth, but he talks a lot in that about story and about selecting the story and about developing the story and developing the script. So I think in this case, from what I know, because obviously he, found the story or got attached to this script before my time. But I think one of the compelling reasons why he was so drawn to it was because it has all of those elements that we just discussed, but also was brilliantly written by a man named Bill Nicholson. And he's a gifted UK writer. And, you know, at one point this was actually going to be done in the UK. And when I got attached, I pushed hard for Australia. I've been living in Australia for just over 10 years and haven't worked here in quite a while, just because, you know, you go where the work is, as one does. But I just thought that this film logistically would lend itself very well in Australia, and specifically in Queensland, because of a number of compelling reasons, which I'm sure we can talk about if you want to.
Yes, please.
So when we were talking about Queensland, because Ron had done another true story, another very complicated water story called In the Heart of the Sea, and he had done that in the UK. And you know, when we started talking about Australia, he told me that so many of his water experts and dive experts and water safety and all of these people were from Australia, and specifically from Queensland.
Yeah.
And so and underwater photographers and all the rest of it. So I started saying, look, you know, I really think we'd be well suited there. You know, Elvis was shooting as we were prepping, but was going to be wrapping just before. I think the timing was right. We could inherit, you know, a great crew. We were also doubling Thailand, as you know, but because, you know, Queensland is tropical and we were shooting kind of, you know, just after summer, we would get the tropical look, and we could do the doubling, and we can do a lot of the things that we could do. Now, obviously, we'll have to go to Thailand and pick up a bunch of things, but you know, that was kind of the initial narrative. And Ron was game. You know, whatever. He's also a very involved producer as a director, and he's very fiscally responsible. And so, you know, he had a relationship with MGM, which in a way is kind of a new, or was at that time, a new regime studio, and now subsequently it's been bought by Amazon. So I guess they did something right. But the interesting part was he started looking at the economics of it, and it started penciling out. And with the help of Screen Queensland and of course the federal government and Screen Australia, we were able to make a compelling enough package to sell to the studio and to say, this is what we'd like to do for all of these reasons. And it worked out great. It's been fantastic.
Well, those incentives are certainly what attract productions, both domestic and international, to Australia and to Queensland. But of course, once you get here, the contribution that you're making, and every film and TV project, the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that these projects invest in Queensland, and the hundreds and thousands of jobs that are created for Queenslanders. And I know from my very brief conversation with Ron, and then on several occasions with you, that you, Ron, and the senior production staff on the project had a lot to say about the quality of the Queensland crew.
Oh, for sure. No, it was great. Look, I've worked in Australia a number of times, but I hadn't worked in Queensland yet. And I had prepped a couple of projects to come up to Queensland. Ironically, they were water-based projects, but never had the pleasure. And on this film, you know, we had again, it comes down to the expertise and experience of the crew with underwater. We had a lot of underwater work, as you can imagine, because so much of the story is told by these divers, you know, going through these dangerous caves and all these things that happen and everything else. And this is part of the story that obviously no one you didn't see on the news, because, you know, there were no cameras in there, of course. So we were kind of recreating very technical and, quite frankly, very dangerous diving sequences with stunt divers and dive doubles and safety divers and underwater cameramen and underwater, you know, just grips, electrician. I mean, everybody that has experience underwater. It's hard enough to do it above water, but then you have another level of expertise underwater. And it was great. You know, Ron was every day just marveled at the expertise and the can-do kind of atmosphere that we had on our set. And I would also say that, you know, at every level, I mean, we were able to, I mean, I'm trying to think how many people we brought in. And mostly it was because of the fact that they had relationships with, you know, long relationships with Ron. So like a production designer, a first AD who happened to be one of the producers, and a stunt coordinator, second unit director. And other than that, everybody else was Australian, and most of them, 90 gazillion percent, were Queenslanders. So no, it worked out great, and everybody was so happy. The studio was blown away by what they've gotten so far. So
that's great news. You talk about how technically and logistically difficult because of underwater and underground shoots, but throw into the mix a lot of child actors and a lot of first-time child actors from Thailand. I mean, that takes a lot of care and attention to care for a young cast like that.
It does, and you know, we had our challenges. I mean, imagine it's hard enough to work with child actors, and then child actors, you know, from Thailand that don't speak English, and you know, they're coming to Australia, and we had to get them passports just to, you know, come across. But I will say, of the 12 kids, 6 of them were Australian, and
Right.
I think 4 of the 6, or maybe 5, 4 of the 6, I think, were actually from Queensland.
Oh, well, there you
go. So we were able to do that. But I also want to say again, you know, my hat off to Ron. Ron Howard, having been a child actor, really knows how to work with and cast child actors. You know, so that was a fascinating process because he just has this ability, like every great director, I think, is great at casting. And there's an old saying, 90% of directing is fixing the mistakes you made in casting. So, you know, if you cast really well, then you have very little to do other than move the camera around, you know. So he made some great calls in casting, and it was challenging for sure. Doing remote casting, doing it via video is not the same as it used to be when you could see the person in the room and be able to coach them. But you know, he made it work. Yeah, there were a lot of challenges with that, and culturally too. We had to make a little manual that said, like, as if we were going to Thailand, that said, you know, there are certain things that you have to be careful of doing culturally, like, you know, you don't pat, you know, kids on the head. That's very offensive. Don't I can't remember them all, but there were things like, you know, don't show the bottom of your foot of your shoe to someone. It's rude. And you know, little cultural things. We had these little manuals that everybody got and memos, and circulated that. And again, one of the advantages we had, just because we were in Queensland, and many of our crew had shot in Thailand, not just once or twice, but a number of times, because if you're going to mount an international production out of Thailand, you're going to bring in a lot of Aussies. So we had that advantage too. So a lot of things that we didn't foresee that worked in our favor, for sure.
That's great. You mentioned Ron's masterclass there, and I will also make mention that if anyone wants to listen to a very good podcast where he is interviewed, the episode of Smartless, the podcast that he was a guest on this year, that's hosted by Jason Bateman, Will Arnett, and Sean Hayes, is very funny because they clearly know each other well, but also just very illuminating about his technique as a director. So you mentioned percentages about directors before, but I read a quote that you gave somewhere about production and how it's 90% preparation and 10% troubleshooting. Does it always work out that way?
Well, not exactly. It is a large percentage. I mean, 90%. Yeah, maybe. I mean, on a really, really easy movie that has no problems and lots of luck, yes, definitely. 90% is in preparation, and the rest of it is just watching it go and waiting for something to fall off, you know, and if it does, then you fix it. But you know, some movies are more physical and how shall I say, labor intensive in the process than others. And I would definitely put something like Fury Road into that category. I mean,
I was going to ask you about that next.
that's
Yeah.
that's a movie that had, 90% in preparation and pre-production, and then another 90% in execution, because it was so uh, it was so complicated. There was so much going on all at the same time, with two units shooting simultaneously, and 110 vehicles that were brought from Australia over to Namibia and spread out all over the desert doing all different things. And we had workshops in different towns, and it was another very military operation, really.
But the backstory of that is the film was supposed to film in Australia.
Yeah.
And what is the reason that you had to move to Namibia?
So when I started so Warner Brothers moved me down to Sydney to oversee Mad Max, which was about to start shooting in October of 2010. And so I went out to Broken Hill, where they'd set up, and they were, getting going, and everybody was out there, and the vehicles and everything. And it was raining in the middle of the desert, and it was kind of like, oh, that's weird, whatever. And the vehicles started getting stuck in the mud. And I said, okay, well, whatever, we'll see how we go. And then it just kept raining, and off and on storms came through. It was one of those wacky winters where it just didn't stop. And by the time November rolled around, it was evident that it wasn't going to, that just, the weather patterns and everything else. And I think it was in December that we decided, okay, we're going to push the beginning of photography out so that all this rain can get through. But that's when the rain, obviously the rain started making the desert bloom. And there are some amazing pictures of this, classic Australian red pan desert. Just it looked like the Wizard of Oz. It was crazy. So we had to kind of pause that and re-prep the film and figure out where else could we do it. And obviously our search was really trying to keep it in Australia, because it's obviously such an iconic Australian story. And we were looking at Lake Eyre, and we were looking at a number of other locations, and to try and find so many things at the same time. We need to have, because remember, this is a very labor-intensive movie, and we were serving between 1,200 and 1,500 lunches every day. That's how big to mount the two units, and everybody had a specialized function on that film. So we had to put people up, we had to have workshops, we had to, we couldn't just move into the middle of the desert and then set up a city, basically, and then set up all this kind of infrastructure. So we looked at places even in WA, and couldn't make it work with all of the logistical demands that we needed. So we started looking further afield, and the Gobi Desert in China, all of the main deserts around the world we started looking at. And Namibia was the place that seemed to make the most sense, mainly because we had a couple of towns that there were, not necessarily cities, but at least towns that were big enough and had enough industry where we could take over a car manufacturing or car assembly plant and use that as sort of our infrastructure for the shops that we needed. And we could take over warehouses and convert them into garages, and we could take over holiday accommodation and put up I think we brought over 800, at one point we had 800 Australians living in Namibia on that film.
Wow.
So, I mean, it was a massive, massive undertaking. And I'm so glad that, all of that hard work and amazing creativity was able to, be shown on the screen, because it all got there for sure. And actually they're doing the next two right now. I think they're starting up.
That's right. Yeah.
So very exciting.
But I mean, that film was a lot of unsafe things that you can think about on set, in terms of cars and explosions and stunts and sand and desert. How do you even plan for, or how do you try to downplay the risks that clearly people are taking every day? That's not just walking on set, saying your lines and walking off.
No, that's true. It's definitely a little bit different than a parlor drama. Well, this is where I really have to give the credit to you know, the filmmaking team on Mad Max, and especially to the safety people, to the stunt people, all Australian, by the way, um, and just, you know, I mean, their level of, and especially on that film, but also one of the reasons why I love shooting in Australia, and again, why, you know, it made a lot of sense to do this very dangerous and technical movie, 13 Lives Here, was, you know, they approach things, they rehearse, they test, they leave so little to chance that, you know, it's not risk-free, but we've mitigated so many of the risks down to something that we feel is manageable. And it is a judgment call at a certain point. But, you know, if you have, you know, redundancies and contingency plans, and make sure that you've, you know, rehearsed it, you have a safety meeting every morning, you talk about what you're going to do, and these people are here and these people are here, and if you have a problem, do this, and everybody understands it and it's ingrained in their head. You know, on Mad Max, every morning there was a whiteboard talk, there was a map on the desk, there were, you know, toy cars, and you know, the whole thing was not just rehearsed for months before and tested and made sure everybody knew what they were doing, but on the morning, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, here are the conditions, here are the areas that we need to be careful of, and you know, I have to say it was. I'm glad to say, I should say, that it was, I don't want to say injury free. I mean, obviously there were some minor injuries, the kind of which, you know, you would have on any film. But it was, there were no fatalities, and very few, I don't even, there were a couple of hard knocks, you know what I mean? And that's something that happens in stunts a lot of times, and especially with the degree of difficulty that we were dealing with. But that movie was all stunts all the time. And to come out of that with, you know, no one being permanently injured, and to just have a couple of knocks, I mean, really, minor injuries is, you know, I mean, we don't want any injuries, of course, but it is pretty miraculous. So yeah, again, my hat is really off to the Australian safety safety crew and the stunt people and the organization and the amount of professionalism that went into it.
I've read that you have said that safety is paramount on set, and that's not just highly technically difficult films that are filled with stunts. And I know that for you, that extends to every person and every role on set. Has that been born out of the fact that in your long career, you have had an opportunity to work in lots of different departments and really sit across all kinds of skills and crew so that you can appreciate what's important for everyone?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. You know, when I was coming up, I started, you know, through being an AD, but then I kind of went to the other side and went into the office and worked in accounts and in production. And then I went back out onto the floor. And, you know, in between jobs, I would work as a grip, where I was, you know, you just do whatever you can. And I think that that's part of it. And then the other part of it is really just having worked all over the world, you know, and not just worked all over the States, but all over North America. But then I started working, you know, internationally. And, you know, we sometimes joke, but it's not a joke. You know, safety never takes a vacation. You know, that's one of the things that that I'll say often, you know, a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's really true. You know, we cannot sacrifice safety, any person's safety, anybody that's on that job, whether they're in front of the camera, behind the camera, if they're a visitor, if they're a guest, if they're an extra, if they're a whatever it is, it doesn't matter. There's no excuse for you know, not being careful and being safe. And if you're hurrying sometimes, because a lot of times, you know, we have to get the shot, or whatever it is, that's where people have to, you know, you really have to remind people, stop, look around, make sure if anything you see here isn't safe, then just stop, take a second. It saves lives, you know, it really does. And unfortunately, we are in an industry where injuries do happen, but I just, you know, I can't stress enough the amount of priority, and sometimes it costs more money, but again, money versus safety, it's always about safety. You have to prepare, and you have to make the right risk assessments, and you have to hire people and work with people to have experience and know what they're doing and trust their expertise. And I think you can do a good job and make the movie magic, but also be safe doing it, so.
Well, I was hoping to get through the conversation without mentioning the dreaded C word, but because 13 Lives was filmed in a very challenging time, let's call it a pandemic.
Yeah.
That really required so much more planning on your part and all of the filmmakers, the studio, and everybody. Can you just talk a little bit about the challenges, because they're going to be with us for a while, about producing with so many extra protocols, and really which follows on from your conversation just then about safety.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a very difficult layer to put on top of something that's already very difficult and layered. I would say the best way of looking at it for me is, I had a lot of conversations with colleagues when I was starting this film, and we were all just figuring it out, and I think we're still figuring it out. That's the best way to look at it, because we have to be nimble, and like with anything, especially in this industry where it's always changing, we have to be you have to kind of look at the situation around you and assess and do the best thing, do the prudent thing, to be able to work with it. So I agree with you. I think it's something that is going to be around. We're going to have to work with it and work and live with it. And we have to do the right thing. And we were fortunate in Australia, and especially in Queensland, that our environment wasn't as affected by it, but that didn't mean that our protocols were any less than really anywhere else in the world. There was one kind of funny story where one of the kids was really excited. It was early in the shoot. I think it was his first day. And he hit the craft service hard and had a bunch of brownies and Coca-Cola and everything else, and then ended up vomiting on the way home.
Oh,
wow. Of course. It was like everything stopped. We had to get a rapid test, make sure the driver was tested, self-quarantine, isolate until the test came back negative. I mean, it was a whole thing. And overnight, we're all like, what do we do? What do we do? So, I mean, it does change things quite a bit.
But it was really just because he had too much sugar.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how careful you are, and how much consideration is going into every production now in Australia. And we're really lucky that production is continuing in our state and others under COVID safe plans and under public health directives. I mean, it makes it that much harder, but I know that film and television sets are being incredibly diligent and very safety conscious, with multiple COVID tests a week for everybody on set. So it is now, it's going to be baked into, I think, productions for a while, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think you're right.
If we just look back to your career a little bit, particularly even just going back just over the decade or so since you've been in Australia, just remind us what brought you to Australia in the first place, and then what kept you here, because you are now a resident of Australia, and you even raised your sons here for a period of time.
Yeah. Well, luck is a big part of my game. I mean, I was very fortunate to have been working for Warner Brothers, who, I mean, that was back in, especially in those days, was, it was the biggest studio in the world, and they were making some really big movies, and they have a very, as you well know, a long history of making films in Australia. So much so that, at one point, they were, they helped build the studio that up in Helensville, and so I just kind of was doing my thing, and the head of production came to me and said, "How would you like to move down to Australia and start supervising all of our Southern Hemisphere films," which we had a lot going at the time. And I said, "Sure." And I put my hand up right away because when I was a kid, I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, which is where the America's Cup races were held for 183 years before Australia took the
Yeah.
cup
Sorry.
in 1983. No, no, no. It was one
Not
of the
sorry.
greatest. It was one of the greatest outcomes of a sporting event I've ever seen. It was so exciting and so well deserved and so much fun. But the point of the story is that I was at 6 and 7 and 8 years old was off to go to sailing lessons with a bunch of Australians that were imported because they were racing and they were training in Newport for this event for decades actually before they won. And so I had, I was 6 years old when I had my first Vegemite, and I was primed to go to go to Australia, and I just figured I would always go. It wasn't even a question, but I hadn't been. And so, when my boss at Warner Brothers said, "Why don't you move down to Australia?" and I jumped at the chance. I knew it would be right. And when I got here, I absolutely fell in love with it, and enough to as you say, raise my sons here and get permanent residency, and hopefully spend the rest of my days here and work here a lot more. With the way the industry is going and the way Australia has been so accommodating and such a great place to shoot with great crews and everything else, I foresee a lot more. So I'm excited.
Then that's our good fortune indeed. I've been asking you some questions as we go along that we're actually sent into us from people who are on the webinar with us today. So I'm just going to have a scan down and pick another one. Someone has asked, what is the biggest challenge currently in the industry? That's a big question, but would you like to tackle that for the screen industry?
Sorry, one more time.
The biggest challenge or challenges, I guess, facing the screen industry, and maybe we'll set COVID aside because that's fairly obvious.
Yeah. Well, in fairness, it's actually a really good time for the screen industry. There's a lot of demand. The streamers, have really opened up, and now the studios have become streamers in essence, but they've really opened up the floodgates in terms of we need more content. And so you're getting, just as many movies, but then you're adding so many of these mega, kind of Game of Thrones style mega series.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Ridley Scott series, Raised by Wolves, which I did over in South Africa a couple of years ago. These are like films. These are like huge 10-hour films, and that's just one season, one series. It's the kind of environment that the challenges aren't so much getting films made. I think films are, they're being made all over the place. I think the challenge right now is finding the space to make them, and finding the crews to make them in those spaces, because as you well know, Queensland is probably as busy as it's ever been.
Yes.
And trying to find a crew can be very, very tricky. Trying to find qualified department heads and all the way down the list. So training, I think, is really important, and I know that we worked very closely with your office on bringing in a number of trainees and attachments so they could get experience and learn firsthand. That was a great program, and I think everybody should be doing that. Not just in Australia, everybody. But it's fantastic. It worked out really well, and all of those candidates did a great job, and we were glad to have them. So yeah, I think the challenges are really just finding that window and being flexible enough to get to the right spot and hire a good crew and find vacancy in a warehouse or a stage, and do a lot.
Anything with 4 walls and a roof at the moment, I think, is being considered. Our own Screen Queensland studios in Brisbane are full with the Joe Exotic production. Village Roadshow is again full with The Wilds and True Spirits and various other productions going in there. obviously 13 Lives shot in a warehouse in Yatala, which I think was quite well known, as well as on location. So it really is, it's peak time, but it does bring its challenges around finding crew and just ensuring that that consistency continues in this industry. I mean, you've had a very freelance life in a way, if you like, because you go project to project. And as you said, you came to Australia to live, but much of what you produce was offshore. But I think the great thing about having so much production in Queensland is giving people a sustainable career in the industry. I'm sure you see people being very pleased about that outcome.
Definitely. I mean, by the way, I was just writing this down, A Freelance Life. That I'm going to appropriate that as my memoir.
I could have said peripatetic, but I don't know if I could spell that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing about, I have a lot to say on that. I mean, it is it's not for everyone. It is kind of a circus. It is the kind of job that you have to be flexible. Sometimes you can work at home. And I think Queenslanders in the last, 5 years or so, 6 years or so, have been blessed with the fact that there is enough film that comes through that keeps them home and working and steady income, and that goes for vendors and everybody else. But yes, I've had a very nomadic life, and I think it kind of, what I was saying about the challenges of filmmaking, and they've really always been there, but now more so. You have to be flexible. You've got to be able to break away from the status quo and say, okay, well, here's the situation. How are we going to do it differently this time? And not take, oh, well, this is the way we always do it, but say, like, for instance, we were talking about studios. We ended up, because we couldn't build because our sets had to be built, obviously in advance, and we didn't have any space in Village Roadshow. So we started looking for warehouses and figuring out how we were going to be able to design and build these underwater caves and sets that were they're very long, you know what I mean? They're very narrow and long in this case. And in retrospect, they probably wouldn't have worked at Village Roadshow, although we could have made them work and it would have been fine. But what it meant was that we had to get more creative on where we were going to shoot. And so we started looking at warehouses and converting them. And you saw our operation there. It was really, we converted these massive warehouses into these studios. I mean, they weren't soundproof, but we were shooting underwater, so we didn't really have to worry about that too much. So again, you kind of use those strengths and weaknesses, and it's a bit of a judo move to figure out, the unique needs and of every film and do that. And I think that, also in my life, I've had to be resourceful and figure out, okay, now I'm doing a movie in Vietnam, I'm doing a movie in, South Africa, I'm doing a movie in Spain, I'm doing a movie in Geneva, like it's different everywhere. I'm doing a movie in Florida, I'm doing a movie in Queensland, so I think that part of it, it's flexible in life and then flexible in your career as well.
We have a couple of questions that people have typed in the Q&A section. This is from Erin, who was the Canadian second unit director from 13 Lives. Oh, second unit DIT from 13 Lives. Don't know if you remember Erin. Sure. Erin is wondering what draws you personally to a project. Are there particular directors' stories or genres that interest you? And you have worked with some of the biggest names. What do you look for now in what draws you to something? Can
I just say, I wish it were up to me. If it were my decision, hello, Mr. Spielberg. Yes. You know what? Again, that's where luck comes in. And I mean, I think you make your own luck to a certain extent, but I've been very, very fortunate to a lot of times just be in the right place at the right time. And, sure, okay, I work hard and I've tried to do the right thing, and I've tried to, conduct my job and execute my job in a way that is, it's a balance between the investor, which is the studio, and the filmmakers. and you have to also, do the right thing for the film. And so it's very much of a balance. But I think when these opportunities come along, it's about seizing them, and it's about saying yes. And I think those are the risks, if you will, that I've taken in order to be successful. And yes, I wish I was like, oh yeah, well, I'm looking for a Ridley Scott project right now. And even, that doesn't work that way. I go where the work is and I do the job. And, you know, um, I think I've been very fortunate that way. So it's a bit of luck.
Is there anything you've ever regretted, but you don't have to say what it was?
Oh, look, I mean, on every job, there are decisions, and, nobody's perfect. And, when you're making, um, I don't know how many decisions a day, but, upwards of, 10, 100, 1,000, I have no idea. You're bound to get it wrong sometimes. So it's, again, all about being nimble enough and being honest enough to cop to the mistake or whatever it is, and to say, I screwed up, and this is how we're gonna fix it. And I think a lot of my early success was because I didn't know better. I took on jobs that were impossible, and because you don't know better, you approach them with a confidence, that maybe naive confidence, that you actually get it done. And many of the jobs that I did when I was starting out, doing a movie like for under $1 million in Los Angeles, with 81 locations, and crazy story and everything else. I couldn't do that now. I have a lot more experience, and I should be better at my job, and I think I am better at my job, but I couldn't do that. So I don't know. It's
But there are a lot of people watching this who would love to have $1 million to play with to make their
I
independent
know. Well,
project. But
and that's the thing. That's the thing. It's like, you can do it. It just takes it just takes confidence in yourself, and honesty, and a lot of hard work, and perseverance. What was I forgot the director that said it, but or producer actually that said it. Films aren't made; they're forged into existence. Yeah.
And they take years and years and years to make. I mean, that's no doubt. Well, we know the year that the 13 Lives event took place, but no doubt it's been worked on as an idea, a story, developed for a very long time to get to this point. And we're looking forward to seeing it next year. I believe it will be
That's
out.
right. Yeah.
There is a question here, and I think you and I talked a little bit about this in our preparation for today, and it's about blockbusters. And this person, who hasn't given their name, but that's all right, with the current releases of blockbuster films having simultaneous releases in theatres and streaming sites, what impact do you think this will have on the production side for future films? It's a very valid question. And you and I talked about the cinema experience, and both how we love going to the cinema, but we also love our streaming platforms.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and honestly, I don't know. I have my theories about it. It's so interesting to watch the industry change, with the technology, and obviously the pandemic, but also just the way the revenue. I mean, it is a film industry, it is a film business. So let's just remember that. And just like the movie business has gone through all of these sweeping changes over the last 20 years. Um, with films, I find it, feature films, let's talk about that, because that's really most of my experiences in feature films. It's really interesting because there was a film that came out that I really wanted to watch, and I realized even with the streaming services, there's a premium to watch it. It was like $29.99 or whatever it was, $32.99, and for the first month of whatever. So instead of going to the theater, I think it was opening in theater simultaneously, and then it was you could get this special premiere, whatever it was, and I realized that's about 2 or 3 movie tickets if I were going to the cinema. And instead of doing that, I was watching it in my home and paying the same amount. And I was like, oh, that's clever. That's interesting to see how that revenue stream seems to be working. So you still can make a big studio film for whatever, I'm making it up, $100 million, and they can recoup that money. What would have been primarily box office tickets is now obviously reduced because of COVID and just the way people are consuming films. But now there's a premium that they make it up on the other side with the streaming and windowing in a way and how they distribute it. So I think it's fascinating. And on top of that, you're paying a subscription to to the streamer, which obviously goes to the overhead. So and then you can watch old films and new films and everything in between. So I think it's fascinating to watch how it evolves, because I think it is still evolving. And I think there's, it's kind of constantly evolving, but I think there's a new way of consuming these blockbuster films, and then also being able to discover tiny independent films that I think you would have had to go to a specialty theater to go see, and you really have to seek it out. And now they're coming to your doorstep. And one of the great things I think Netflix and a lot of the streamers are doing, and Australia is I think leading the way, is insisting on local programming. So you are getting more homegrown international films. So you'll be seeing movies from, I mentioned Vietnam earlier. I mean, there are some amazing films coming out of Vietnam. There, all the countries around the world. Malaysia, there was some interesting films coming out of there that I'm getting access to, and I don't have to chase down. I'm seeing them on Netflix, and it's because they're doing local programming. So I think it's really interesting to see how it all unfolds.
Cinemas are doing it tough in Australia right now because of lockdowns and restrictions, and I think we do all love the collective experience of watching something on a big screen. And I hope for Australian films, independent films, studio films, that experience continues, because it's just a wonderful way to enjoy a film. But you're right, you get that you get that real discovery with streaming platforms. You don't know what you're going to stumble across. And I've found that word of mouth now is even the bigger recommendation, or rather than a search engine or a review. We share in our office, what are you watching, what are you consuming, what have you seen, which just shows how much we value screen entertainment, which I'm delighted with. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to touch on the fact that I know you've really enjoyed teaching, Jon. You've really had that experience in the US where you've taught classes. Is that something that you will do more of?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I really enjoyed it. For 2 years, I taught at UCLA Producing 101, kind of the overall producing class. So it was really wonderful, actually, because the students were from all walks of life. Some recent graduates, some that were thinking about transitioning from their current career into film. And all ages and all walks of life, and it was a lot of fun because we did it very kind of top line. It was a 3-hour class once a week, but in the 3 hours, I would usually have a guest speaker come in either for the first hour or the final hour, and just give anecdotes and maybe it was the writer when we were talking about development, or maybe it was the accountant when we were talking about financing, or et cetera. And it was great, and I'd love to do that. I'd love to continue to do it. I enjoy it, and I love watching people say, "Oh, that's how they did that," or whatever it is. It's a lot of fun because when I will say again, I'm very fortunate and very grateful that I'm in this industry and that I've been able to make a living at it, because it is the kind of thing that people are interested in. And when we all go to weddings and talk, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm an undertaker. Oh, that's fascinating. Oh yeah, I produce films. Like, really? Okay. And then invariably, of course, everyone says, who's the best person you've worked with and who's the worst person you worked with?
I didn't ask you that, by the way.
I know. Thank you very much.
I didn't want to be indiscreet. I got one more question. This is actually from Dean Gibson, Queensland filmmaker, and he's interested to know whether you're interested in factual work. You mentioned Ron Howard's documentary work. Is factual an area that you'd be interested in working on in the future?
You know, like I said, I'm open to a lot of things, but you know, when you say factual work, I mean, is that documentaries? I find documentaries fascinating because there's no script. I mean, yes, of course, you have to have a plan. You've got to have a story. You've got to have an outline. But the writing of a documentary is in the filming of it, and I think that's really fascinating. I mean, obviously, it depends on what the subject matter is and what you're doing, but that is kind of almost like the magical art of filmmaking, because it's so real, and it, of course, it's, you know, it's documentary, but it's so I don't know how documentary filmmakers do it, because there's a very good chance that you're not going to end up with, you don't know, you know, and by the way, you don't know in drama or in, you know, in regular feature filmmaking, fictional, but you know, at least there you can read a script, you can envision what the, you know, how the film is going to play and all of those things, and then it's about execution. But I don't know, documentaries frighten me, to be honest with you.
Something that you'll enjoy watching, maybe, rather than
exactly.
Now you're headed off. You're leaving Queensland soon and headed down south. Are you able to say what you're going to work on?
Yeah, no, I'm doing a little family film that I'm producing this time, as opposed to line producing or executive producing or, you know, any of the other things that I do. And this one is it's the old cartoon character Woody Woodpecker. So Universal Pictures, the character was debuted in the 1940s, and it's been a kind of beloved Loki-like, you know, agent of chaos cartoon character. And so this is another Australian success film, success story, because this film originally was going to be shot in Atlanta, Georgia. And then COVID happened and it was kind of shuttered up. And that, you know, made me available for 13 Lives. But also during the time that I was doing 13 Lives, I was talking to the studio and I was saying, you know, you really should consider doing this in Australia. I think it would work really well here. And, you know, it's not a big film. It's actually quite a small film. But, you know, this division of Universal was keen to come to Australia. The problem has been that they can't figure out how to get the minimum spend that you need for the location offset, which is, you know, obviously one of the big drivers of making it economically viable. And so I said to them, well, if you trust me, and if you trust the fact that Australia has a very, very well-established and incredibly talented post-production and animation and visual effects industry, which they do, then you do everything in Australia, everything from woe to go, the whole thing, all the technicians, everybody, you know, fair dinkum, Aussie, you know, kind of production, and you can do it. And they said, well, let's see what that looks like. So I did some back of envelope budgets for them, and they liked the idea, and we progressed it. And now we're going to be shooting toward the end of the year in Melbourne, Woody Woodpecker. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Thank you. I'll be sad to leave Queensland. I have to say, the weather's great, and it's been,
people are lovely.
And the people are lovely, and it's been great, and working with you. But it won't be the last time. We'll be back very soon.
No, we know you will be back, and of course we all very much look forward to seeing 13 Lives next year. Jon, you've been so generous with your time today. Thank you very much. It was illuminating and fascinating, and I think we managed to get to most of the questions people asked. If we didn't get your question asked and answered, I'm sorry, but it was a great hour and a great conversation. So thank you, Jon, and best wishes for the next project.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and look forward to coming back soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us today.